Preview. Civil society organizations are ensuring that they do their part when it comes to the outcome document for the fourth SIDS Conference, which will be held here in Antigua and Barbuda. The CSO organizations say that the progress when it comes to sustainable development in the Caribbean region is disheartening, especially considering the accelerated rate in which climate change is taking place.
What we heard from people at the Caribbean Civil Society Summit was really some disappointment, that the document could not be more ambitious. They felt in many areas that it was fairly weak, and there were either gaps which simply did not appear, or in some cases there were red flags, things that civil society was concerned about. However, they did recognize some positive elements that they could leverage. So we talked quite a bit, for example, about climate change, and civil society in the Caribbean feels the document is quite disappointing. It could certainly be stronger and more ambitious in calling for civil society action. But we do recognize there is at least that call, for example, for more climate finance, for SIDS and for development partners to meet those obligations and commitments that have been made globally. So that's something to leverage on. But then what's missing is, one thing civil society feels is really important is that climate finance that gets to SIDS needs to be channeled to the ground, to the community level where the vulnerable and marginalized groups are who are most impacted by climate change. So we need to have mechanisms in place to channel that funding down. And that kind of thinking of how to get climate finance best utilized so it's most effective is not treated in the document. And this is a role that Caribbean civil society feels it can play as well, in terms of being there, working on the ground to deliver climate action, helping vulnerable communities. And this role is not recognized in the document.
The Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, which is the outcome document for the SIDS4 Conference, does not adequately provide provisions on gender. Even though the document references gender 13 times and women 7 times, the language that is used is not very progressive, especially when we look to documents from 10, 20, 30 years ago, like the Barbados document in 1994 and even the Samoa Pathway from 2014. Those documents do a much better job of including gender throughout all sections of the document, which includes gender-responsive budgeting approaches, which includes gender-responsive or even transformative approaches to disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and adaptation. And beyond that, just provisions to protect women and girls, men and boys, and gender diverse folks. I was really disappointed to see no mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights in the ABBA's document, even though we all know that SRHR is integral for gender equality for small and developing states, especially when so many small and developing states have such high rates of things like gender-based violence.
CANARI organized a pre-summit to mobilize and prepare civil society ahead of the conference. Both Leotaud and Alexander indicate that civil society was not adequately consulted in the process to draft the Abbas document. Although CANARI and a handful of CSOs were invited to contribute during the regional Caribbean meeting, Leotaud says they did not have space to input properly into serious discussions regarding the document. Alexander further expresses her frustration at the fact that SIDS countries were not even negotiating on their own behalf, but rather represented by G77 countries who decided what the SIDS needs for development instead of the SIDS themselves.